Wie geht's? Kultur in Zeiten des Coronavirus. Welcome to this international edition of Wie geht's, a podcast of conversations with people working in the arts, cultural policy and the creative sector, reflecting on how the coronavirus crisis affects the cultural sphere. My name is Martin Zierold. I'm the director of the Institute for Arts and Media Management at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Hamburg, Germany, which is producing this podcast. Our title, Wie geht's, has a double meaning in German. It translates as, how are you? We want to know how people in the arts are doing during these extraordinary and challenging times. Yet, Wie geht's also means, how does it work? On this podcast, we hope to share fresh ideas, learnings, stories, how we learn to rethink our practices and our role for societies as we try to come to grips with this crisis. It's been a while since we last took an in-depth look into an international project in this podcast. My guest today is Tim Etchells, the artistic director of Forced Entertainment, a group of 6 artists collaborating to make original theatre and performances together since 1984. Forced Entertainment is among the best known and best loved performing arts ensembles and have over the decades received numerous awards, amongst them the renowned International Ibsen Award in 2016. Tim is also a visual artist and author whose work has been shown in institutions including Tate Modern, Hayward Gallery and Witte de Wit, whilst his performances, either solo with Forced Entertainment or in collaboration with other artists, choreographers and musicians, have been presented in venues including the Barbican Center, Centre Pompidou Paris, Volksbühne Berlin, Tanzquartier Wien and the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, to name but a few. In our conversation today, we will mostly focus on his work with Forced Entertainment, who are currently streaming their brilliant project Tabletop Shakespeare at Home, a retelling of all of Shakespeare's 36 plays, each presented with household items in lieu of the different actors in the plays. The project will continue until mid-November, with all performances available for streaming and a new play added every Thursday to Sunday night. Go check them out if you haven't done so far. I'm connected via Zoom with Tim Etchells, the founder and artistic director of Forced Entertainment and also an author of various novels, producer of installations and artists, almost in a traditional sense, an all-round artist. It's great, Tim, that you find the time to talk to me. And we're going to be addressing lots of your work with the company and also by yourselves. But the first question in the podcast is always the same. In Germany, I would be asking, Wie geht's? In English, one meaning of that is, how are you?
I'm okay. I feel, it's a strange situation in that I'm very aware that I'm lucky. I have work that I can keep doing at home and income from that. And my work doesn't oblige me right now to go out into the world or be working every day in the supermarket or, as an Uber driver or, anything of that kind. So I feel, really lucky to have this different kind of space. And of course it's weird because suddenly, I was traveling a huge amount and working in lots of different contexts internationally and nationally, and now suddenly I don't go anywhere. Nothing is happening. A lot of work has stopped, everything's postponed or cancelled. But nonetheless, there are things to do and there's interesting work to do actually. So I feel, lucky and I guess a bit, of course, unsettled by everything that's happening, but doing okay,
Yeah. One question before we focus on the artistic work and the implications the COVID crisis has for that in terms of artistic work, but also in terms of the social context, also the economical context. As in Germany, the media has very much focused on the situation in various regions in Germany. I have the impression that since your prime minister was ill himself, when that was in the media, there's not much reporting about the situation in Britain at this point. So how's daily life like in Britain at this moment?
It's difficult to say. I mean, my daily life is I leave the house once a day. We walk to the park, which is about maybe 500, 600 meters away. And we walk in the park, which connects to another park. We do the same route every day. It's maybe about 6-7 kilometers. And we walk, and then we run, and then we walk again. And so I see like 2 streets and a park. That's it. And this hasn't changed much in the last 6 months. That's been life. I'm avoiding public transport. I'm avoiding the shops. Wouldn't go anywhere or do anything or see anybody. We've met a few friends in the park or in the garden lately. So it's very, in a way, the knowledge that one has is really limited. I think for me, because I have kind of health conditions that mean that I'm pretty unkeen to get the coronavirus for myself, just because I'm not sure that I would survive it, really. I have cardiac problems since I was born, which have gotten more complicated as I've gotten older. So I'm pretty, risk averse when it comes to the virus. So what I can tell you about life in the UK right now is what I'm hearing from friends and what I'm reading in the newspaper. And case numbers are increasing fairly disastrously. We're back up to sort of 5,000-6,000 cases a day now. It seems to be escalating out of control. They're starting to put more severe lockdown in different parts of the country, especially the north. There's been a total failure, really, by the government to plan effectively, to take decisive and useful action, and to communicate well. And they've really lost. They've done many things wrong, but I think one of the things they've done absolutely disastrously is communicate. They've done that so badly. They've basically lost people's trust. And that's led to, I think, especially in the north, people are not necessarily taking the guidance seriously. Partly because they don't even understand it. It's not that they argue with it. It's just that it's actually incomprehensible. What they're saying, it doesn't make any sense. So it's tricky here. I think, as it is, in many places, and this second wave that we're seeing, and I really think they've blown the clarity of communication and the effectiveness of action as well. They just haven't done it.
Which seems like a worst case scenario in times like these, when you actually would need public support and trust in the actions taken. But as we look at what is its meaning for culture and the arts, and it's always most interesting to talk about like the personal experiences. So you're usually doing solo projects, but you're also doing a lot of work with the company Force Entertainment. How has the COVID crisis affected your work? I guess on many levels.
Yeah, on lots. In the initial period, sort of from March onwards, there were probably 2 to 3 months where we felt very busy, but most of the busyness was to do with postponing or cancelling or trying to make plans or figuring out what to do. And it was an awful lot of work, mostly about not doing anything. And then I think over time what happened is that some plans became possible. So we created a a digital work for Zoom, which was realized in partnership with How in Berlin, Pact in Essen, and Musenturm in Frankfurt. And so that was pretty early on, I guess, that we sort of switched into that mode, and we made a piece of work in 3 episodes, which were broadcast to internet, and then stayed there, I think, until the end of August. So that was good, and it meant we were suddenly busy with a new creative project that, you know, hadn't been in our planning, but was a reaction to where we were and also how we could work, because we were all in different places and we could work together over a platform like this one. And it was interesting to do that. It felt really good. And then we started to plan other projects. We did a few tests for some other things, and then we finally began work on the Shakespeare project, the Complete Works one, which we've live streamed before, but now we're presenting the works from people's homes, which again, you know, feels like a kind of reaction to the, you know, obvious constraints of the situation. And meanwhile, now planning and looking at next year and starting to say, you know, how likely are we to be performing in March? How likely are we to be performing in May? How likely are we to be performing in September? You know, and so you're just like everybody, really, I guess, you know, in every business and in every area of art practice and life, people are looking at the calendar and trying to, you know, make guesses about what might be possible.
And like the notion, at least that was very strong around here in March, was like, if we make it to the summer, somehow we'll have managed. And then over time, of course, everybody realized it's not a question about months. It's more a question about like what's going to be in a year, and maybe even longer than that, like you say. Before we talk about your various digital projects, I'd love to address the idea of an ensemble. I think one of the beauties of forced entertainment is if people follow your work over years and by now even decades, it's really an ensemble. You see the same people on stage. In a way, you grow old with them, even following that work. And I imagine it must be very difficult to like work as an ensemble in the conditions that COVID dictates. So how have you been addressing that in your internal work to still keep that collaborative spirit that I guess is like a signature of forced entertainment's work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it certainly would be a difficult moment to start a collective work or a collective ensemble. I guess one of the things we have is, because we have 36 years of collective working, there's a very solid foundation there. And I feel like that, in a way, just doesn't go away. So we might be apart in the normal year because maybe a couple of people are touring a particular work, other people aren't involved, or a chunk of the group are doing one thing, I'm not there. We're not necessarily, together all the time anyway, even if we're busy, which we often are. But as soon as we're back in the rehearsal room, of course, all of that history and all of that shared knowledge comes back. I think what we have been doing is we've been meeting probably at least once a week, if not more often, depending on what we're busy with, online to talk about projects or to make decisions, but also, I guess, to catch up and to sort of see where people are at. This is a weird space, the digital space, but in some ways, I don't know, we've been working, of course, all of us have been working to some extent remotely on projects for a long time. And there is a way of being here and of sharing communication and thinking together. It's different. but it's possible. And you realize very quickly what the limits of this are. And I suppose over time, you start to find ways to get around those. I mean, what's interesting, that one of the things that we notice is that when we're working in the real world, in the rehearsal room, there's a lot of silence, because a conversation will get to a certain point, and then people will just sit. And anybody who comes to observe us rehearsing is always a little bit terrified by how much of the day can go by with people just sitting there, like, not saying anything. Zoom doesn't like that. It's very, very hard as a group to sit in silence in Zoom. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's keeping us chatting to each other. But it's interesting, the difference that this space kind of imposes on the work. I say I'm glad that we've got the structure there already. The years have already been racked up. I think we rely on that. We're burning up the reserves that have been there for a long time.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how the digital obviously leads to another kind of communication. Would you say that gets visible in the productions for somebody who just viewed some of that work online? Is it a different artistic product due to the different process of communication in the rehearsal phase?
Well, I think certainly End Meeting for All, which was made as a sort of, one sentence description of it was that it was a sort of Zoom meeting gone wrong, or it was almost like the idea that the six of us had been in some state of isolation and quarantine for a very long time, and this was the only communication that was possible. And yeah, you do in that work, you definitely see a very different. The structure of the platform is the thing that informs the way that we relate to each other, and the energy of that particular work. I think it's really, really strongly. I liken it to, I suppose, every work that we make, what you're always looking for is a sort of universe or an ethos or a set of materials that you're dealing with. And in a funny sort of way with that work, the Zoom grid and all of its, weird ways of treating audio or cutting people out sometimes and not hearing people and stuff, that became the ground that we were sort of negotiating. Just as in another work, the ground might be a pile of a particular kind of materials or a text, so it became a reaction to the space. Complete works, which we're doing now, I would say less so, partly because it's an existing project anyway. But I think, that project, which consists of these explanations or story-told versions of the Shakespeare plays done on the tabletop with objects standing in for the characters. For me, that work's always had, at least at one level, it's always had an element of YouTube tutorial. It's always been a sort of makeover or how to take apart your vacuum cleaner. And in this case, the vacuum cleaner is the Shakespeare play. The one-on-one to camera thing. So I do think that project also has its traces in this digital space. And of course, now we present them from people's houses, from people's own kitchen tables or spare rooms or whatever. That also lends it this, connection to the way that we're all, many of us now, living and working in the same space. There's not a theater to go to right now. So the kitchen table becomes the theatre. So in that sense, yeah, I think they do speak to and come from this moment that we're in right now.
And talking about the tabletop Shakespeare, which is something that I think will go on till November, so people can really watch past productions that are still there, and there's more coming up over the next few weeks. And I really can recommend it. I've seen the production in the theater a while ago. Not all of them, obviously, but a number. And I've seen some streams before the COVID times of it. And already before COVID, I was amazed how that production, in a way, seems so theatrical if you see it in a theater. And in a way, to me, and I first saw it live, really represented what theater can be if you really reduce it to the presence of a person and the power of narration and the power of like really magically transforming objects into characters. And at some point you really feel like the energy between objects that are just there, put on the table. So it's so theatrical. It so relies on the presence on the one hand. And then when I watched the stream for the first time, I felt like it's one of the very few theater performances that I actually can stand watching for the full time on a screen, because it also does work, like you say, almost like a YouTube video, where there's like the basics of Shakespeare explained. And actually, I really hope you're going to produce that again when my kids go to school. I will have Shakespeare on the curriculum, because I think it's one of the best access points you can find also. So how would you like this? What's the speciality, or what makes it special that it works so well in those both spheres, when most of the streaming that was done in the first few months, to me, more was like an example of how difficult it is to actually move performances to the television or computer screen?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, we've always, we've done streaming of some of the durational works, and we've streamed the Shakespeare project, but we have always resisted streaming any of the, what we would call theatre shows. I don't particularly have, generally I don't have much interest in watching that kind of theatre in that way. I mean, I can do if I have to study it or something, but normally it's not interesting to me. I think in the case of the Shakespeare project is the fact that you reduce the stage to the tabletop and you reduce the performance to a single person, and they have a direct relation to the audience, which can be the camera. And because of that, it has a sort of weird, electronic intimacy that somehow does, relates to theatre, but it also does relate to the sort of presence that people have in YouTube tutorials or vlogging. So I think it just suits the form, and I think that's always, for me, that's always with every project, what you're trying to do is to find a match between, what the work is, what the content is, and the form. And those two things are so indivisible, actually, obviously, that, you have to have it has to be a perfect fit there. It's interesting. We did some experiments. One of the things we did in maybe May or June was we did some experiments with existing durational works that we have. So, and on the 1,000th Night, which is the King's storytelling piece, and Quizula, we tried those on Zoom with people in different places just to see what about them was working and what was not working. Because we had sort of, I suppose initially we thought, well, we could do one or both of those online just as an offer. And interestingly, and on the 1,000th Night, we worked for a couple of days on that. And at the end of those 2 days, we said, we're never going to do this in this format. It doesn't work. Because it doesn't know who it's talking to. There's nobody there. and that for that piece, it's absolutely crippling. Whereas Quizula, because you're chatting to another person, you're asking each other questions. There is that feeling when you're watching it that you're sort of peering into a private conversation. And dynamically, although there's no audience, it means that the two performers can backwards and forwards between each other quite happily. So we felt like, okay, Quizula is really an option. So we may do that sometime, maybe in December or in January or February or something. But Thousandth Night, The Kings, no, it was just. But that for us, that's really the thing, is that we absolutely wanted to test out what the dynamic was in this new space, and we've just made a very, complete decision that the form wasn't really suiting the material of that work, that's pretty much how we approach everything, I think.
And in that context, I'd also like to know how you see or envision working in the digital sphere post-COVID, when actually it's a choice again and no longer like the only space that's really available. Because it sounds to me like that even the distinction between stage and digital isn't the most important one, probably, but rather like the material and the idea, and then that will find its form. At the same time, I think hardly any theater works that way at this point. Most will want to go back on the stage as soon as possible and see the digital more as a surrogate of what they can do at this point, but really don't want to embrace fully. So how do you see your own path going ahead in terms of digital work?
Yeah, that's interesting. Interestingly, we're working on something new, which will open probably open in March next year, all things being equal, let's say. And one of the things we found is that we're in the work we're doing right now, I'm not sure how long this will last, but at the moment, we are being drawn into conversations about laptops and screens and things. And it's interesting to me because we haven't, and this is for a live work, because we haven't really been doing that on stage for a long time. And back in the sort of early 90s or so, we were quite often seen with some video monitors knocking around. But it's been a long time. And I sort of feel like maybe that's the relation to the screen, the relation to the camera. Those things have slightly come back on our radar collectively because of what's been happening. I'm sure that we will keep working on that, and we'll keep working on things that are intended as, pure digital. It's interesting to think, it is interesting to think what this idea of an afterwards and how things will. I don't think anything will go back to being the same. I think liveness will be different, and I think digital will be different as well. I think I'm thinking about it a lot in terms of, okay, what if, in really broad terms, what effect is this strange hiatus going to produce, not just for the arts, but I mean for societies in the broadest sense? And of course, it's too early to know, really, because I think it takes time to process these things. We're aware right now of some pretty immediate reactions or sets of thoughts, but I really wonder what will happen to the different generations who've been impacted by this in different ways. You take somebody like me. I've probably been in motion constantly for 30 years. Probably in that 30 years, I've been somewhere different at least every fortnight, if not every week, whether it's London, Sheffield, Brussels, or Paris or Berlin or further afield. It's been constant, and now suddenly there's 6 months where I've not been further than the end of the road. And in some ways, I don't mind it. I miss a lot of things, but I'm also interested in this slowing. So I do wonder, what this will mean. I don't think we know yet. We won't know for a year or two, really.
No, I definitely agree. I think that's some point in hindsight, maybe a narrative will emerge that gives meaning to it in one way or the other. I had a conversation with a friend a while who's same age like me, and he remembered the Chernobyl nuclear crisis in a way as something of his childhood, where suddenly daily life was disrupted, and you looked at the rain and thought that, oh, maybe this rain might be contaminated. This rain could be dangerous, although I can't see it. It looks like the same rain. And we were wondering how kids, the age today that we were when Chernobyl happened, what it means to them that suddenly people are invisibly dangerous. They're the same people, but you might be infected by them. So I think on these levels, even unconsciously, it's so hard to tell how that might affect the relation socially over years to come, that we now learn to fear each other on this viral biological level, and that distancing is something positive. So I think it's a strange situation. It's so hard to fantasize about where this could lead to, positively as well as a dystopia.
Yeah, but I think that's super interesting, and of course it is in one sense an accident, or not an accident, that the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests internationally have happened in this time. So you've seen this amazing tension between all of these reasons to stay apart, and then all of these urgencies about gathering and coming into public space to protest and to demand change. And I think, again, there's a sort of galvanizing force to this moment, and all of these things are connected in ways that, again, we won't be able to really understand them for some time. But it's fascinating and inspiring to be part of this moment where, in one sense, things are so dire, but where in another sense, the seeds of all kinds of possible change are fermenting. I mean, in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of the kind of social change we're seeing and how that might relate to global warming, people realizing that you don't need to go there, that you can do the meeting this way. I think there's going to be an impact there. I think it sort of, in a way, I mean, it's maybe being too optimistic to think that it's, is a reset point. Of course, the urgency in some quarters is to just get back to normal as quickly as possible. But I do think that there's an opportunity to think otherwise, and think about what something other than return to normal might be.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's even hard to use the word normal the same way as we would have quite naturally before for that moment, because so much doesn't look that normal anymore, even from the time before the COVID crisis. Has your view of the role of the arts or artistic work for society changed due to this very special conjuncture in a way, and then this feeling like there could be a seed of multiple possibilities that probably wasn't that tangible even a year ago? Do you think artistic work should reflect that, or has a different role or task even in that time, or hasn't that changed in your perspective?
In some ways, I think it's sharpening. That's what I would say. It's sharpening my sense of what artwork and artistic practice is about. I don't feel it's completely changing it, because I suppose I come from a place where, on the one hand, I feel like the work with the company is expressly a kind of open research process. We've never set out to make a performance really about anything. I even struggle with the idea of aboutness. I'm committed to working with the group and in my own work on projects that arise from practice in the studio, from discoveries, from material that sort of fascinates or grips one for reasons that one can't understand. And because of that, I'm always slightly dubious about a kind of didactic or preconceived idea of the work as having a kind of didactic function, because I don't trust it really. I trust that I see something in the studio or I see something on the page that's got a kind of claw that grabs me. This I totally trust, but more than that, I don't trust. But, paradoxically, I think in parallel to that, I have always believed and really believe even more strongly now that this open research process is about uncovering material that somehow speaks to the cultural moment, somehow speaks to the political urgencies and necessities of the time. So shows like Real Magic or Out of Order, which are the two larger theatre pieces that we've produced most recently, there was no intention with either of those pieces to make a piece that was somehow a reflection on our current political and social ills. But I think in the end, both of them do that. And I think everybody who sees them recognizes that their dramas about certain kinds of stuckness, certain kinds of violence, certain kinds of cultural repetition, and certain human impulses to escape or subvert or get out of those. And, and again, so for me, it's interesting that the sort of, on the one hand, there's a commitment to this rather open research, and on the other hand, there's a belief that that's the thing that gets you to the material that speaks in some way to the situation that we're in. But the thing that's sharpening for me is that art and politics are deeply linked, and that I'm not interested in, I suppose, a frivolousness. What matters to me is work that's amplifying and reflecting on and speaking to the situation that we're in. I mean, and it might be doing that in strange ways. That's a commitment from me. But I think we have to be dealing with what's happening on all the levels that it's happening. And I think this strange space that we're in, where we can't gather, where we can't collectively go through the sort of journeys that we go through normally in theatre, maybe it makes me hanker, wish for that space, because it's the space where we're collectively in a conversation of a sort about where we are and what's needed.
Yeah, and I think I can really relate to this idea of not being didactical about it. I mean, in the end, if theater just is a speech that could have been written in an essay, it gets uninteresting very, very quickly. But this openness and this relation also, and openness to different relations, I really find that embodied in the work that you do also. My probably like a huge question, and also maybe a depressing question potentially, but I think a question I need to ask is, how do you see the potential to deliver on this openness in the future? As I guess in Britain, like in many countries and also in Germany, artists are really economically in a crisis that they can't even sustain a few more weeks or months potentially. So do you see, is there any optimism for you that the artistic world will survive in such a diverse way and lively way through this crisis in terms of like the economical and social context, with no income, low income, and all the challenges that there are around right now?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really troubling time, and I suppose depending on where you look, the situation, I mean, in the UK anyway, the situation's slightly different. So you have the bigger institutions who have reserves financially. They have large numbers of precarious staff that they can get rid of, which they are doing. And they can protect their sort of core mission at a human cost that's quite hard to justify, I think. You have other organizations that are a little bit in between, in the sense that they have a little bit of structure and a little bit of money and a little bit of security, maybe to last until March next year or something. They're not on the emergency list right now, but they will be. So that's another worry. And then you've got the huge freelance scene. And that scene has been extremely poorly looked after by this government, anyway. Some people have had some support, some not. It's fading out now. It's fading out in October, even the support that there has been. So I think probably October, November, December is going to be bad. Because even people who've had a little bit of security through this period will lose it. I think a lot of organizations will go down in October, November, December, because the government support's going, and after that, it won't make any sense for them to continue. And the freelancers also, it's a very severe situation. So in that sense, I'm quite pessimistic. I mean, the optimism I have is slightly different, which is that I think artists will find a way, because they do. That's not to use that as an excuse for a sort of negligent government policy or for lack of economic support. But I think people with urgencies, people with creative urgencies, artistic urgencies, find ways. I think the loss though is that is of course that it's easier to do that if you come from an already privileged position, you know. So middle class white people will find it easier to keep on in the arts. People, working class people, black people, people of color, whose economic position in the first place or social context might be different, will find it harder to do so. And that's going to be a real damaging loss, because it's bad enough anyway as far as the diversity of the scene goes. But this, what's happening, probably will only make that worse, to be honest. And that's horrible. It's really horrible.
I'd like to ask a question. What can somebody who not considers themselves an artist, but rather like an audience interested in like participating on the level of like a viewer, what can they do? I've seen that you do the streaming, for example, for free, but there's a possibility to donate. Is that something that gets to a level that's relevant for the work you do, that actually the donations ordinary people do after watching a stream is a serious income in a way for Foster Entertainment's business model, in inverted commas? Or what other kind of support would you hope for from your audiences?
Well, the financial element, we've rarely done that in the past. I think we maybe on one previous occasion we put a call for donations around live streaming. I suppose that's you can see that as a kind of testing the water, really, to see if there's a way to replace any part of the income that we've lost from all of the touring that we would have been doing with revenue from streaming. Most, I would say, generally speaking, that's not a huge financial impact. But on the other hand, the ecology financially of the company's fairly delicate. So actually, small amounts, can make a difference as time goes on. Certainly, and I think it also pays to be at least putting that possibility there. And we're really, I think, grateful for people who've been able to donate to support the company and the work that we're doing. It's slightly alien to us. I mean, we're not based in America, so that the whole public giving and donations culture it doesn't really have a ground here in the UK, but it does have it in some other places, and I think it can be a part of what we do going forwards. We'd rather that, I suppose, than try to sell tickets for things online. We don't want to get into a kind of pay-per-view model. We're committed to the idea that work goes onto the internet and it's free if people want to watch it. That feels important right now. It's more important to reach people than to make a gamble on trying to squeeze €5 out of everybody that watches a Shakespeare online kind of thing. But what can people do? I mean, I don't know. I suppose if I think about what I try to do in terms of other artists, I think engaging is the thing. I mean, I think it's letting people know that their work is valuable. It's telling other people about it. It's writing to people. It's about advocating for the work that people are doing. I think, one of the weird things about this, the pandemic, is it's so fundamentally isolating for everybody in different ways. So I think everything that's about gathering and connecting is a form of support at the moment. That's what it feels like to me, anyway. I've been interested by the fact that, I have friends who live, 5 or 6 miles down the road. I never see them now because I'm not going on the bus. So we see maybe in the park occasionally, but it's as easy to connect to friends in Toronto or in Berlin or in Paris or in New York as it is to see friends down the road, because we're seeing everybody here. So it's sort of meant this interesting, slight redrawing of where the conversations can be. I've definitely had a set of conversations with friends and artists who are in quite different places, who ordinarily I might not talk to them, or I might just bump into them at the bar somewhere. But now it's a little bit more like trying to concretely draw a line between this place and that place and make an hour where you can chat. So I think that it's interesting. I think a different kinds of community lines can be drawn in this zone that probably we weren't necessarily that good at drawing before. I find that useful also.
Yeah. And for me, like the podcast in a way is also an example of that, because I realized very quickly after the lockdown in Germany how important these informal conversations that usually you don't even notice consciously, how inspiring they can be. And once they're taken away from you because you don't meet people on corridors, you don't meet people in coffee breaks of conferences or in the foyer of a theater anymore, it's a massive impact to like the inspiration and then also the human connection you feel in your everyday. And
Absolutely.
This is also one attempt of like trying to keep that alive in a different format. And maybe that's already the answer to my final question, because the final question I usually ask my guests is where do you find inspiration in these strange and challenging times? You already mentioned you're taking the walk on a daily basis. What's the practice you could associate most with finding inspiration at this moment?
Well, yeah, the walking's been good. And the fact that we've chosen to walk the same route every day for the last 6 months. We've been GPS mapping it and also writing a little around it. So it's going to become a project of some kind. I've been reading more, I have to say, which is really good. And strangely, reading more poetry than I used to read. I kind of went off reading poetry for probably about 10 years, I think. But in the last 2 years, and especially in this lockdown period, I've been reading more poetry. An American poet called Joshua Bennett has a book called Ode, Owed, which I've really, really liked. Made me think a lot about the fact that poetry is a kind of, can be an amazing window or portal to another person's life experience and worldview. I mean, in this sort of very constellated, condensed form. So that was a real revelation and a joy. And it also made me think about poetry in the sense that it contains knowledge in a way that's maybe just very explicitly linked to form and to its own sort of unfolding on the page and in time. So I've had the feeling reading that, and I read before that Aimé Césaire's book, which is called Notebook on the Return to a Native Land, which, again, it had me thinking about the fact that you can think that you know something while you're reading poetry because of the way that it's unfolding and the way that the language is in you at the particular moment of reading. And that knowledge, in one sense, disappears after you've finished reading it. You kind of want to read it again because you sort of thought you knew it while you were reading it, and then it's gone. And I guess for me, that's a little bit like the knowledge that art produces anyway. It's not reducible to a sort of a set of statements that you can handily refer to later. It is somewhat ephemeral, the production that it does. But I've been very interested, I suppose, in that. I think it's also how performance works. But I'm very interested in that sense of these very powerful, but nonetheless slightly intangible knowledges. Maybe that's the kind of thing you start thinking about when you haven't left the house, except for once a day in 5 months. Sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thanks also for sharing the tips, and we put the links online in the show notes for the podcast so that people can look up the two authors here and poets you mentioned.
A few of the Joshua Bennett pieces are online. A place, I think it's Poetry Foundation. There's one in particular called The Book of Micah, which is a really great poem. But they have 2 or 3 of his pieces there. Definitely worth a look.
Yeah, great. We put the links online. So Tim, thank you very much for your time and for having this conversation. If you want to, if you like to, one idea is to have revisited conversations in a few months' time to see where things are going. We've identified a number of topics where we felt like it's going to be interesting how things proceed. So I might approach you next year to have another conversation if you want to. For today, I just want to say thank you, and it's been really great talking to you.
Thank you, and yeah, I'd love to chat again in a few months. That'd be lovely. Yeah.
This was the 57th edition of our podcast, Wie geht's? The cultural sphere during the coronavirus crisis. We will continue to produce English editions. These and all previous editions can be easily accessed through the website covid-culture.com. Next week, we will continue looking at the performing arts in a conversation with Amelie Deufelhardt from Hamburg's Kampnagel Performing Arts Center. This edition will be in German again. I'm looking forward to my next conversations. Take care. Bis bald. Passen Sie gut auf sich auf.